here. And you know what? Let's start off with the economy. I mean, right now in the United States, we're getting GDP numbers. They've come out with 4.1% or something like that. Unemployment's really, really low, but we're seeing some other strange things happening with the housing market, where out in Canada, it looks like the bubble's popping. Australia, it looks like the bubble's popping. We see the prices are coming down in the US. We're seeing retail, they're having a huge amount of troubles. I wanted to get your take on what is happening with this economy, because it seems like the numbers aren't matching up with what's really happening in the economy.
But, there's nothing new there. I'm pretty sure your audience remembers my views on the U.S. economy, and it's basically that this whole mythology of quote-unquote the U.S. recovery and now the supposed U.S. growth cycle, there's no substance to it. And the starting point in exposing the mythology is just for people to look at the civilian participation report. And that's a measurement of the number of people that are actually working in the United States, expressed as a percentage of the population. And so it's not really a statistic that can be gained by the oligarchs. And so it's one of the reasons that, looking at that number is a way to actually get a glimpse of reality. And it's produced by the Federal Reserve itself. So, this is as official as it gets. And if you go and look at that chart, what it shows is that since the beginning of the supposed U.S. recovery, civilian participation rate has plunged by roughly 3%, which, in overall historical terms is a very large drop. And it translates into the fact that since the start of this mythical recovery, the U.S. economy on a net basis has lost about another 3 or 4 million jobs. So, I can't even keep track of the fantasy numbers they come up with as to how many, fantasy jobs have been created, quote unquote, in this mythical recovery. But I think they're up somewhere in the neighborhood of 16 million now. And that means when you subtract that from the fact that the U.S. economy has actually lost another 3 to 4 million jobs, it means that since this whole episode of mythology began, the U.S. government has manufactured somewhere close to 20 million imaginary jobs. So there's never been any new jobs created, not going back to the beginning of Obama's reign of error and all of the further declines that took place, and certainly nothing in the way of job growth since Trump took over.
Are they using the same calculations that Obama was using? Has anything changed in the way they do the calculation, or are they just keeping everything the same?
So I don't really, with my new work at Stockhouse, it's a lot more market-oriented, so I don't spend as much time looking at the macroeconomic statistics as I used to. So in that respect, I don't have a precise answer for you. And you don't really need to have a precise answer because, of course, the civilian participation rate provides the overall picture, the big picture. For a long time, or I shouldn't say a long time, but for several years, the particular method of lying that was used to fabricate these imaginary jobs is what is known as the birth-death model. And you probably heard of it. It's this fabrication invented by some of the puppet economists working for the U.S. government. It never had any validity, but it was included as a way of massaging the jobs numbers. And the way it worked at the peak of the insanity is the birth-death model was adding well over 1 million jobs a year, up around 1.3 million jobs per year. In other words, more than 100,000 jobs per month. At the end of the year, after all these months of lying takes place, the U.S. government would announce its quote-unquote recalculation, where it took a look at what actually happened. And literally, it would not only subtract 100% of all those birth-death jobs. Sometimes it would even be more than 100%. In other words, instead of the birth-death model supposed to add jobs in a particular year, when they actually applied the calculation retroactively, it would have subtracted jobs from the U.S. economy. So they did that for a while, but people caught on to that. So then, we need new ways of lying with numbers. So the big favorite, as far as I am aware, and I mean, things could have changed again in the last year or so, but certainly for a few years there, the big new method of lying with numbers is quote unquote seasonal adjustments. And so, my favorite one-liner when it comes to talking about seasonal adjustments and the U.S. jobs market is that the biggest jobs creator, quote unquote, in the U.S. economy now is the calendar. So, basically you have the government making all of these large seasonal, quote unquote, seasonal adjustments month after month after month, juicing the jobs numbers. And you see, the thing you have to understand is that there is some legitimacy in making seasonal adjustments to economic statistics. But the whole point is, in order for this to have any validity over the course of a year, those seasonal adjustments must always net to zero. And so this, of course, is not what's happening. The seasonal adjustments are literally adding jobs virtually every month all year long. You may get an occasional month where it'll knock off, some microscopic number of jobs just to try to feign validity. But then, month after month of large seasonal adjustments for no reason whatsoever.
And, the whole job situation really doesn't make sense. I mean, if you watch and you hear and you see, all the different retail stores closing down. I mean, Toys R Us, it wasn't just, the stores, it was the corporate offices. And, there's many, many other stores with their corporate offices that are closing. And these are all jobs that are being lost. And, when you hear all this and you hear the number of jobs being lost, it really makes no sense in what they're calculating here.
But then you have to understand this whole new branch of propaganda and revisionism that's becoming ever more pervasive in the mainstream media. And it's articles that literally come up with some variation of the theme that you can't trust your own perceptions, so you need to listen to the experts. Forget about all the homeless people you see in the streets of the cities. Forget about all the bankruptcy signs you see in the storefronts and the foreclosure signs you see in front of people's houses. Listen to the experts who tell you that the economy is booming. and there's more and more of that. And I mean, it's, some of the most evil propaganda because, of course, it just creates a greater and greater disconnect with reality. I'm pretty sure in my previous appearances here, I've talked before about what I call the Wonderland Matrix, which is this whole propaganda world that the oligarchs have manufactured. And I call it the Wonderland Matrix because unlike the movie version of the Matrix, our Matrix makes no sense at all. So, that's the whole thing about this propaganda matrix where they're talking about growing economies and jobs. It makes no sense at all.
Now, even when we look at the stock market and the S&P 500, we're seeing that at all-time new highs. And, the market is continually moving up and it stays up. And, from different news reports and different financial pundits, we find out that, central banks have been purchasing tech stocks, like the Swiss National Bank. They've been purchasing a lot of the tech stocks, pouring money into there. They're creating currency out of thin air and pouring it into the stock market. So from your point of view and from your research and everything that you've been looking at, I mean, is the stock market, is it still being manipulated to the level it was before, or are things now evening out and it's more organic?
I'm not quite sure how to answer that because my opinion for several years is basically 24/7 saturation manipulation all the time, basically all markets, certainly all Western markets. And, probably in the past we've discussed the trading algorithms that now contaminate all of our markets. And specifically, the bankers have what I call the master trading algorithm, which they now use to lead all the markets around by the nose. And I mean, we no longer even have markets because the definition of a market is humans trading with humans. And that's no longer what we have. As far as I know, roughly 75% of all volume now, and more in some markets, is nothing but computers trading with computers. And then, even more corrupt is so much of this volume is wash trades. which are supposed to be illegal. At one point I saw a lawsuit that was directed against the Chicago Mercantile Exchange a couple of years ago. I don't know whatever happened of it, but the plaintiffs were alleging that they had evidence showing that half of all the trades on the Chicago Mercantile Exchange were wash trades. And I don't know, is your audience familiar with this term, Dave?
I don't know. Can you explain what a wash trade is?
So a wash trade officially is when you have J.P. Morgan on the buying end of a trade and J.P. Morgan on the selling end of a trade. Literally somebody claiming to be selling shares for themselves. And of course, the reason it's considered obvious manipulation and it's supposed to be illegal is because there's no real transaction taking place. Your left hand can't sell something to your right hand. But what your left hand and your right hand can do if you're able to stage sham transactions is affect the prices in markets, which of course is why wash trading is supposed to be illegal. But I mean, that was just what this lawsuit was alleging in terms of official wash trading. J.P. Morgan trading with J.P. Morgan, Goldman Sachs trading with Goldman Sachs. As your audience knows from my previous appearances here, I'm firmly convinced that all of these big banks are part of a single crime syndicate. And in fact, it's certainly not my theory because it's based upon computer modeling that was done by a trio of academics in Switzerland that basically postulated there was a super entity that by itself controls 40% of the global economy and basically all of the entire financial sector. And but so the point is if these banks are in fact all part of a single crime syndicate, then if J.P. Morgan is trading with Goldman Sachs, it's not really a legitimate trade. It's still a wash trade. It's still trading that has no legitimate purpose because if you're all, I mean, obviously, I mean, I shouldn't say never has a legitimate purpose. There could be instances where, you know, J.P. Morgan has a client that wants to sell something. Goldman Sachs has a client that wants to buy something. You know, there can certainly be legitimate instances of trading like that taking place. But at the same time, much of that trading could be just as illegitimate. You know, Goldman Sachs trading with J.P. Morgan simply to influence the price of a particular company and not because there's any actual real trading taking place.
I wanted to move on to cryptocurrencies. Last time you were on, you talked about cryptocurrencies, Bitcoin, and you made the statement that it could be that the powers that be, the establishment, they might be purchasing a lot of these coins to then dump them later on to bring the price down, almost like what they've done with gold, with paper contracts and things like that. And we see now that the price of Bitcoin has come down quite a bit, and then which dragged a lot of the other coins down. Back then, I think you were saying they were going to do this on purpose. Have they succeeded in driving people away from the crypto market? And, you know, what was the whole purpose of doing this? When
cryptocurrencies first came into existence, you know, some people that I know and respect were big proponents of Bitcoin and cryptocurrencies as a general concept. And their reasoning was that, well, you know, this is wonderful. This is going to be a medium of exchange that's outside of the control of the banking crime syndicate. But where they lost me was when they started talking about how Bitcoin was quote unquote incorruptible. And, you know, that was when, you know, my skepticism kicked in because, I've written about this crime syndicate for a long period of time. I've gotten a fairly good understanding of how they like to operate. And I mean, it's so often it's just a matter of brute force. So when they talked about how, you know, this market could somehow be incorruptible, that's when I just started to laugh because anything that can exist in a market can be corrupted by bankers in general, and in particular, it can be corrupted by anybody with enough capital. And so the very obvious way to corrupt the Bitcoin market and the market of any other cryptocurrency was simply for the bankers to step in with a bunch of their worthless funny money and buy up the majority of Bitcoin. And so this is why I was telling anybody who would listen, expect to see this spectacular spiral in price because when the bankers acquire their massive share, the only way they can do that over a short period of time is by, producing that sort of a spike. And similarly, when they decide to bail out, they'll take it down equally precipitously. And the motivation is precisely what I was just alluding to. The bankers are not going to allow this competition to their own criminal empire. Like the printing presses of Western central banks represent the single largest criminal scam in the history of humanity. And Bitcoin and cryptocurrencies in general was a direct competition and thus a direct threat for this scam. So obviously the bankers were never going to sit back and just allow the people, proposing this bold new experiment to, operate without interference. And then that was just, of course, the most obvious way to manipulate the Bitcoin market back when there was no more infrastructure in place. But I mean, since then, and what's, of course, even more ludicrous is that there's now a quote-unquote Bitcoin futures market. And I mean, this is just more corruption. I mean, the nature, like Bitcoin is simply not amenable to a futures market. It's not a commodity. It's a computer program that generates a unit of currency. And, this erroneous trend of a lot of people to treat it as a commodity, it's absurd. And it's been part of what's allowed the bankers to perpetrate this additional fraud, is by them now treating it as a commodity and having it fall under the supervision of the ultra-corrupt CFTC. So, there's futures trading, of course, as we've discussed in the past, precious metals market is one of the tools that the bankers used to manipulate precious metals prices lower back when they didn't have their trading algorithms already in place. And I was actually really surprised. I was listening to an interview of a CEO for a blockchain company. I don't want to talk about names in particular, but I was shocked to hear this person specifically and candidly discuss how the futures market was being used to suppress the price of Bitcoin. Because, I mean, supposedly that could never happen. Supposedly Bitcoin is quote-unquote independent, incorruptible. The only thing that it's ever supposed to influence the price of Bitcoin is the trading of Bitcoin, in terms of people either acquiring more or divesting themselves of some. And so that's no longer true. But like I say, it was something I saw coming because there really couldn't be any other way this could turn out. And so similarly, Bitcoin is a massive threat to the bankers' paper printing empire. It cannot be allowed to exist without interference. And they've gone out of their way, of course, to discredit it with propaganda. Now, I even saw this hilarious article, when the U.S. economy started to waver, market started to waver, blaming Bitcoin. And I mean, these prostitutes in the media will stoop to anything. But so then now you also have blockchain. So again, some people that I like and respect have said wonderful things about blockchain. Blockchain is going to revolutionize commerce. It's incorruptible. It's outside the banking chain. Well, so the difference between blockchain and cryptocurrencies is that blockchain technology is effectively a replacement for banks as an institution to a large extent. So, I mean, my open question to your audience and yourself is, if the bankers were not about to allow the Bitcoin market to progress unimpeded and without interference, are they really going to allow this to happen with blockchain? Or are they going to find a way to either take complete control of blockchain and corrupt it, or discredit in some manner, or maybe even have it, banned for some bogus reason? And I mean, I don't want to go supplying the bankers with too many reasons or too many, ideas, because last thing I want to do is to be the inspiration for some of their nefarious schemes.
I think the central bankers, they will do whatever they have to keep their system alive. I mean, look at the precious metals market. They've manipulated that for a very long time. Anything that comes up against their, what you call funny money, anything that comes up that goes against it, they will try to corrupt it. Or destroy it. Yeah. They just don't want it to exist because, they can't control it. And, really with gold, it was just a piece of metal. I mean, who would ever think they would create this gigantic paper market where they would be able to control gold? If you mention that, many, many years ago, people would be like, that's crazy. And then today, it's not crazy.
Just a piece of metal, Dave, you wound me. And the ghost of Howard Buffett, Warren Buffett's father, will be, turning over in his grave. Howard Buffett came out with a famous article where he equated gold as being an indispensable component of human liberty. So, naturally, Howard Buffett's son, the beloved market prostitute Warren Buffett, has forgotten everything his father taught him. But I certainly haven't forgotten this. And of course, the big thing that your audience can never forget is that the major devolution and decline in standard of living and the change that began to take place in our society, all of this took place with the assassination of the gold standard at the beginning of the 1970s. And all the social changes that took place, the assassination of unions. Of course, when the gold standard was assassinated, this set off a massive inflation spiral. And then the oligarchs and their puppet politicians used that as an opportunity to demonize the unions. And, all the unions, the greedy, quote unquote, greedy unions were blamed for driving up all the prices. Not the fact that the gold standard had been abolished and our paper currency no longer had any value. And so prices are running wild as a reaction to that. That wasn't the reason. It was the greedy unions. And then, of course, unions are now an endangered species in our economies. And the drop in our standard of living has paralleled these two trends: the abolition of most of our unions, the assassination of the gold standard, and the allowing the bankers to run wild with their corrupt monetary system.
Yeah, whenever something changes in the economy, like coming off the gold standard, like Nixon, said it was speculators, this is part of their narrative, part of their story, where they make people believe that, this is what's happening, but behind the scenes, something else is really happening. Like when we were coming off the gold standard, it wasn't really speculators. They were moving us to a completely different system, and they didn't want anyone to know this. So they have to make up these stories, and that's why they probably use the story of unions driving up prices, because as you continually, print more and more money, the value of that currency drops, and they have to come up with some reasoning of why all this is happening.
Well, and in fact, the assassination of the gold standard was literally a century-long crusade. It began well back in the 19th century, when, of course, the bankers managed to finally get their dream and install a central bank in the United States. And then the 20th century rolled around, and then they got their second crack at the central bank. So the whole problem, from the bankers' perspective, with getting their opportunity to have these paper printing machines at their disposal, was they're completely incompatible with the gold standard. The two of the principal virtues of gold standard are what the infamous puppet John Maynard Keynes described disparagingly as, quote unquote, the golden handcuffs. The gold standard serves to restrain the money printing of central banks, and it serves to restrain the ability of our governments to incur debt. So, why are we better off with a gold standard? Well, the two things that these bankers and our corrupt governments have done more than anything else to undermine our standard of living and destroy our economies are to destroy the value of our currencies with the excessive money printing of the bankers, and to bankrupt our economies with the excessive debt financing of our governments. And while it's not impossible to do these things over a greatly extended period of time with a gold standard in place, it was necessary to get the gold standard out of the way in order for these criminal trends to be dramatically accelerated. And so, we went from having an absolute hard gold standard in the early part of the 20th century to this quote-unquote Bretton Woods Agreement, which created this quasi gold standard, which then stayed in existence for roughly another half century before, the assassination event, which of course now Paul Volcker takes full credit for. He wanted to set the record straight there that, we shouldn't give Richard Nixon credit for assassinating the gold standard, that he was the driving force behind that. And which of course makes Paul Volcker one of the most evil figures of the 20th century.
What's very interesting is that Russia, China, and other countries, they're starting to use their own national currencies. And of course, as everyone knows at this point, the dollar is really an instrument of debt. It is created by the central bank. And actually, we're in a central bank economy. This is not a people's economy. This is not something that we would want. And Russia right now is out there saying that countries should use their own national currencies because the dollar is being used for placing sanctions on certain countries. It's being misused, and countries should shift away from that. Do you think this is a movement to move away from the central banking system?
Well, no, it's part of the continued movement away from the U.S. dollar specifically. And at this sort of late stage in the game, in particular what you're quoting from Russia, it's a little bit of revenge on the part of Putin, because one of the big motivations for the entire anti-Russia crusade that's been manufactured in the U.S., all of the anti-Russia propaganda, Russia's done nothing wrong over the past decade when, I guess it hasn't been that long, the 6 to 8 years that it's been constantly demonized in the U.S. media and by the U.S. government. Every supposed transgression of Russia has been either a pure fabrication of Western media or a contrivance that was actually orchestrated by the West and somehow blamed in Russia. So, for instance, we have the coup in Ukraine, and then the thugs that the West used as their tools to stage this coup go on this bloody rampage. And so the large ethnic Russian majority in the what was then a Ukrainian province of Crimea voted overwhelmingly to be reabsorbed into Russia. They wanted to be saved from these thugs because these thugs had a strong bias against Russian nationals. And so Russia's been demonized for, quote unquote, annexing the Crimea. I mean, these people begged Russia to rescue them. And then, of course, beyond that, Russia does obviously have an important military port there. So, I mean, this was going to happen. But, I mean, it was not the international crime portrayed in the West, because this was a totally amicable occurrence. There was not a drop of blood shed in the Crimea. And so, I mean, it goes on and on. But so the reason this whole demonization campaign took place was because of Russia's big campaign to move away from the U.S. dollar. And also, of course, the other thing Russia has been doing for a long period of time is buying gold on the open market. And both of those things are kind of the ultimate red flags to wave in front of the U.S. bull.
I mean, if Russia's calling to, other countries to move away from the dollar, actually there's countries in Africa saying they don't even know why they're using the dollar. They're doing a lot more business with China and they should be using the yuan. Now, if countries move away from the dollar and they're listening to Russia, because a lot of countries are siding with Russia, what happens to the dollar at this point if countries decide not to keep the dollar in their reserves?
Well, so going back as far as 2010, I wrote a commentary entitled 3 Reasons Why the U.S. Dollar is Already Worthless. One of those reasons was the Bernanke helicopter drop. And I'm sure I've discussed this chart at some point, but when Bernanke went on his insane money printing binge following the crash of 2008, the monetary base of the United States went literally vertical. And for anybody who has an understanding of exponential functions, anytime an exponential function gets that extreme, it's the literal mathematical representation of out of control. And at that point, once the chart of the U.S. Monetary base depicted this, there was only two possible outcomes. Take the foot off of the accelerator and have the U.S. monetary system instantly implode, or keep the foot all the way to the floor and then, end up in this spectacular explosion. And so from that basis alone, the U.S. dollar was rendered worthless by the Bernanke helicopter drop, because there was no possible point of return from a mathematical basis at this point. It was also rendered worthless because of the fact that the world's been phasing out the U.S. dollar. And this also goes back even to before 2010. So, for instance, China in particular has been most active here. It's been going around the world doing these quote-unquote bilateral currency agreements and currency swaps with nations. And what this has been effectively doing is draining the swamp. So the hilarious thing is that for quite a while, the United States government was still trumpeting the fact that China was still accumulating a fair number of U.S. dollars because it really was forced to do so because of its U.S. trade. But then, what China's been doing basically also is using its own currency to buy up U.S. dollars. So a lot of this accumulation of U.S. dollars wasn't a positive case of China, being, consumers of U.S. currency from the U.S. It was acquiring U.S. dollar from other sources, supplying these other nations with renminbi in particular, and then once those other nations were supplied with renminbi, the U.S. dollar was out of the picture. So, for instance, and I haven't even looked at this transition for several years now, but going back to 2012, 2013, 7 of Asia's largest economies were already using the renminbi as their quote-unquote reserve currency, their primary currency for international trade. And as you say, all these African nations now are doing more trade with the U.S. than they're doing with China. And, of course, this is one of the many reasons that China wants to be seen as a good citizen with respect to the rest of the global community in terms of being a trade partner, is because this is another means of phasing out the use of the U.S. dollar. So on this basis alone, the U.S. dollar has also been rendered worthless. But see, what's happening here that disguises this plunge to worthlessness and the hyperinflation that's already occurred with the U.S. dollar is the saturation manipulation of currency markets. And again, it's algorithm manipulation. And again, it's not a secret. The big banks of the West have been criminally convicted of manipulating all of the world's currency markets going back to at least 2008. They're convicted of manipulating the U.S. dollar up and all the other currencies down. Relentlessly. U.S. dollar up, all the other currencies down. And when you have this almost omnipotent tool for pushing markets in one direction or another, you can maintain a sham like this for an extended period of time.
Where do you think the economy is going to be going? I mean, can they keep this going much longer? I mean, since 2008, here we are at 2018, and we see, the Fed, they're raising interest rates. They're unwinding right now, and we're starting to see cracks in the economy. Do you think we're at the end stage of what they've done, keeping this illusion alive?
Well, so the only time that I can really think of when I've been definitely wrong, and something I've been pointing towards in terms of a coming trend, was when I talked about how we were going to see a big crash in 2016. And I was basing that basically on previous patterns, that we'd been seeing this 8-year bubble and crash cycle in the U.S. to coincide with a political cycle, to help the makers reset their market so they could go on another, bubble and crash binge where they steal all the way up as the markets go higher and steal all the way down when they go lower. But so I've been rethinking that whole idea, especially since it's now been proven incorrect. And so a couple things. First of all, I seriously wonder whether even the bankers themselves think that our crippled, bankrupted economies and worthless currencies can survive any significant downward plunge. Because the reality is that to survive any real recession, any significant economic contraction, you have to have some sort of resources you can cannibalize. What actually happened after the crash of 2008, when there wasn't really anything left to cannibalize, is, I mean, they emptied out the treasuries and gave it to the big banks, but then they just printed up vast amounts of currency across the Western world, and that was what unleashed this horrible wave of inflation that showed up in particular in food prices and then in real estate markets. But the other thing that is a factor here is, and I think we have also talked about this previously, is when the bankers totally corrupted the U.S. monetary system, when they drove the U.S. Federal Reserve overnight lending rate to 0% and made the U.S. monetary system totally fraudulent, they enabled literally infinite counterfeiting. And they had $3 trillion of funny money that Bernanke had conjured into existence as a base for this infinite counterfeiting. So, and I mean, like I said, literally infinite. And I mean, just three banks operating in a chain could literally and legally counterfeit $1 quadrillion US. Now, my personal model and the model of the Swiss academics is there's a couple dozen, at least a couple of dozen of these banks tightly linked in this crime syndicate, which translates into, like I say, literally infinite capacity for counterfeiting. So then, if the banks are sitting with this hidden source of infinite, quote unquote, money, where's the profit incentive? Previously, the main reason we always had these resets in our markets was because it was no longer possible for the bankers to do any significant stealing. You know, they were just playing with their own money at the top of the market by that point. So they had to